He was called the Candy Man, trusted by parents, adored by kids. But behind closed doors, he was hiding one of the darkest killing sprees in American history. In the early 1970s, one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history unfolded in the shadows of Houston, Texas, a story that would later be called the Houston Mass Murders. At the heart of it was a man whose friendly nickname masked a horrifying truth: Dean Arnold Corll, infamously known as the Candyman. Corll wasn't always a figure of terror. Born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, he later moved to Houston with his family and took a role in their Corll Candy Company, earning the trust of neighborhood children with free sweets. To the adults around him, he seemed harmless, just a local candy factory worker and friendly face. But beneath that sugar-coated exterior was a monster. Over a 3-year span beginning in 1970, Corll abducted, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 29 boys and young men, most in their mid-teens. To lure his victims, Corll exploited the same charm that earned him his sugar-sweet nickname. He offered rides in his vehicles, promised parties and fun, or doused his targets with drugs and alcohol until they were unconscious. Then, with a methodical cruelty, he either strangled them or shot them with a .22 caliber pistol before burying their bodies in secluded locations. A rundown boat shed, wood near Lake Sam Rayburn, and beaches on the Texas Gulf Coast. Initially, Corll didn't act alone. He was aided by 2 teenage accomplices. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Brooks had known Corll since childhood, and at first, both teenagers thought they were just hanging out or making money. Corll even paid Henley for odd jobs and promised cash for each boy he could bring to Corll's house, a horrifying incentive that would draw them deeper into corruption and carnage. But what started as a promise of easy money became something far more sinister. The crimes escalated as both teens helped Corll identify victims, sometimes luring in friends or acquaintances who never returned home. The violence was brutal and systematized. Victims would be restrained on a homemade torture board, assaulted over hours or days, then killed and buried in plastic sheeting. For years, the killings went unnoticed or were dismissed as runaways, missing without a trace. Parents were told their sons had run away or vanished without explanation. The scale of the murders was so massive that by the time the truth came out, dozens of families would be shattered. On August 8, 1973, all of that changed forever. On that day, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley walked into Corll's Pasadena home with 2 friends, 20-year-old Timothy Cordell Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Louise Williams. The trio arrived early in the morning, around 3 a.m., thinking they were going to hang out or maybe party. But the night quickly turned into a nightmare. When they awoke, all 3 were bound and gagged. Corll had them restrained with ropes and tape, preparing to repeat his unfathomable pattern of terror. Corll tied Curley and Williams to his infamous torture board and began sexually assaulting Curley. Then, in one of the darkest moments of the whole saga, he handed Henley a knife and ordered him to strip Williams. Henley's own testimony later described the horror of the scene, the helplessness and fear of knowing what was coming next. But something inside Henley snapped that night. Whether it was fear for his own life, guilt for what he had been part of, or a sudden realization of the monster Corll truly was, Henley made a decision that would end the massacre. As Corll focused on his attack, Henley seized a nearby gun, one of Corll's pistols, and fired until the weapon was empty, striking the serial killer again and again, ultimately ending his life. Corll died in that house, his body left in a room that had become the scene of decades of brutality. Because of Henley's desperate act, shooting Corll 6 times, the bloodshed finally stopped. If Henley hadn't acted, Corll was moments away from murdering Curley and Williams and claiming 2 more victims that same day. Word of Henley's actions spread quickly. At first, many saw him as a hero, the teen who killed one of America's most frightening serial killers and freed 2 young people from certain death. But that narrative didn't last long. When investigators talked to Henley, his confession would reveal something far more disturbing than a lone act of self-defense. At the moment when everything hung in the balance, when Corll was seconds away from claiming 2 more lives, it wasn't just fear that drove Elmer Wayne Henley to act. It was a desperate response to a terrifying command. According to Henley's later testimony, it was Rhonda Louise Williams' plea that sparked his decision. Bound and terrified, she begged him to stop what was happening to them. In that instant, Henley reached for Corll's handgun, which had been sitting on a nearby table, and fired until the magazine was empty. Each shot rang out, echoing through the house where so much evil had been done. With the final round fired, Dean Corll, the man who had taken at least 29 young lives, lay dead. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the Pasadena residence, summoned by frantic reports of gunfire. They found Henley, Curley, and Williams alive, shaken and covered in the remnants of an unimaginable ordeal. At first glance, law enforcement believed Henley was a victim, a terrified teen who had killed a madman to save himself and his friends. The initial investigation suggested that Henley had acted in self-defense, and detectives prepared to release him. After all, Corll's body lay in a pool of blood. 2 potential victims were unharmed. It looked like a last-second rescue. But that simple narrative didn't last long. When officers began questioning Henley further about the crimes, they were stunned by what he revealed. Instead of insisting he was an unwitting victim, Henley confessed, not only to being present during Corll's final moments, but to having been actively involved in the serial killer's crimes for months. More shocking still, he said he knew where Corll's victims were buried. Henley's confession fractured the initial belief that he was merely a hero. Instead, he admitted he had been part of the killer's inner circle, a willing accomplice. According to his testimony, Henley first crossed paths with Corll through his friend David Owen Brooks, another teenager who had become entangled with the killer. Corll had known Brooks since the boy was around 12 years old, and the pair had a close relationship built over shared time in Corll's candy factory and at local gatherings. For the boys in the neighborhood, Corll seemed like a strange but benign adult who handed out sweets and let them hang around his place. That facade of harmlessness was powerful, and it drew Henley in. In fact, Henley admitted that at first he wasn't involved in murder at all. Corll had employed him to rob houses, paying him small amounts for each burglary. It was work, Henley said later, that introduced him to Corll's world and desensitized him to wrongdoing. That all changed when Corll made an offer Henley struggled to refuse. $200 for every boy he could bring to Corll's home. For a working-class teenager in early 1970s Texas with limited opportunities, the money was a powerful lure. Henley began to recruit acquaintances, classmates, friends of friends, bringing them to Corll's house under one pretext or another. But once inside, those boys were never seen again. As time went on, Henley realized the full horror of what was happening. Corll wasn't just abusing his victims. He was slowly building a pattern of systematic torture and murder stretching back years. According to Henley's confession, once Corll had his guest bound, the killing would begin, sometimes after days of torment, sometimes in a matter of hours. Corll would assault them, use homemade torture devices, and record his brutality before ending their lives. Henley didn't just watch, either. Over time, he became complicit, participating in the long sessions of cruelty and even helping to dispose of the bodies afterward. That was how he knew where the remains were hidden. After his shocking admission, investigators took him to several locations around Houston. There, Henley led them to the mass graves Corll had spent years concealing. The first of these sites was a rickety boat shed in Pasadena, where the stench of death still lingered. Beneath the floorboards and among stacks of wooden planks, officers unearthed the remains of 17 victims, young boys aged between 13 and their early 20s. It was a burial ground Corll had constructed piece by piece, covering body after body in plastic sheeting. But the horrors weren't confined to that one location. At a nearby lake, Henley directed detectives to a second dump site where 2 more sets of remains were found. And on a lonely stretch of coastal beach, 6 additional bodies were recovered, some partially exposed by tides and erosion, others still hidden beneath sand and seaweed. Those discoveries brought the total number of confirmed victims to 25, and investigators knew it wasn't the end. Over the following decade, as more searches were conducted and old leads revisited, additional bodies were uncovered in and around the Houston area. each one a solemn reminder of the scale of Corll's cruelty. Henley's confession didn't just change the case database. It reshaped the narrative of the Candyman killings forever. What had begun as a bizarre chain of disappearances became the largest known serial murder case in American history at that time, with dozens of boys and young men lost to cruelty that should never have been possible. And it was Henley's horrifying choice to speak, even partially, that finally gave the families of the missing something they had long been denied: answers. In the aftermath of the confessions and the mass grave discoveries, public perception of Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. shifted dramatically. What had briefly appeared to be a story of a teenage hero stopping a monster quickly became something far more disturbing. Henley was no longer viewed as merely a survivor who acted in self-defense. He was now recognized as an active participant in one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. Henley was just 17 years old when he was formally charged with murder. Prosecutors focused on the crimes that could be directly tied to him, the victims he personally lured to Dean Corll's home, knowing what awaited them. Ultimately, Henley was tried and convicted for the murder of 6 victims, all boys he had helped deliver into Corll's control. Although the conviction initially stood, Henley successfully appealed the verdict, forcing the courts to retry the case. For a brief moment, it appeared that the legal outcome might change. But during the retrial, prosecutors again laid out the chilling evidence. Henley's own detailed confessions, his guidance to the burial sites, and testimony describing his role in the torture and disposal of victims' bodies. Once more, the jury found him guilty, and this time the sentence was final. Henley was sentenced to life in prison, where he would spend decades behind bars. A teenager when he entered, aging into an elderly man within the Texas prison system. At the time, Henley's own words did little to generate sympathy. In an interview with Texas Monthly, Henley expressed what many perceive as emotional detachment from his crimes. He stated, "I feel remorse because I'm supposed to. That's something I've tried to build in me. I don't really feel about it, you know? I wished I hadn't done it. I'm glad I got it over with telling. I'm glad now I'm not hiding it, waiting, and Dean ain't out there killing little kids. But as far as any emotion to it, there's no heartfelt emotion." The quote stunned readers. Rather than sorrow or visible guilt, Henley described remorse as something intellectual, something learned, not felt. For the families of the victims, those words reopened wounds that would never fully heal. As the years passed, Henley remained incarcerated while the memory of the Houston mass murders continued to haunt the city. Investigators and historians revisited the case repeatedly, attempting to understand how such a large-scale killing operation could go undetected for so long, and how teenagers had become willing accomplices to unimaginable violence. Today, Henley is 69 years old and has spent more than 50 years in prison. According to his own claims, time has changed him. He now insists that he feels genuine remorse and has sought a second chance through the parole system. His initial parole attempt was denied in November, but Henley has stated that he intends to continue applying, hoping that age, time served, and rehabilitation will eventually work in his favor. Whether that day will come remains uncertain. Meanwhile, the shadow of Dean Arnold Corll still looms large over true crime history. Corll is officially believed to have murdered at least 29 victims, though investigators and researchers have long suspected that the real number could be over 40. Many missing youths from the era were never found, leaving open the possibility that some victims may never be identified. At the time of his death in 1973, Corll was considered the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Only 3 other serial killers are believed to have surpassed his victim count, one of them being John Wayne Gacy, who would later cite Corll as a personal influence. That chilling connection links 2 of America's most notorious murderers in a legacy of cruelty that spanned generations. The Candyman killings remain one of the most disturbing cases ever uncovered, not only because of the number of victims, but because of how ordinary the participants once seemed. A candy factory worker, neighborhood teenagers, familiar streets, friendly invitations. What began as disappearances dismissed as runaways ultimately revealed a hidden network of manipulation violence, and betrayal. One that ended only when a killer was shot by his own accomplice. And even now, decades later, the story continues. Through parole hearings, unanswered questions, and families still carrying the weight of what was taken from them. Do you believe someone who helped a serial killer deserves parole? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more crime stories unfolded.